Hey, everybody. Great to see you again. It's an honor to be here with Natalie. A lot of you may have seen that she gave a speech this week in Washington in front of the U.S. government, many government officials. And I just wanted to preface this by saying that we're not necessarily here to talk about hodling or different kind of, pizza day or cultural memes. We actually want to talk about the impact that Bitcoin might have on society from like a long-term point of view. And in her speech in DC, Natalie kind of questioned the direction in which the U.S. government's policies have taken over the last 50 years when it comes to basic freedoms that were outlined in our Constitution, at least in our country. And basically, she challenged and questioned the policies that lawmakers and judges have sort of brought to bear on the people of America when it comes to financial surveillance. And I thought it was really interesting that you talked about, for example, the post office and some of the founding values institutions that were created at the beginning of America's story, which were explicitly created to prevent surveillance. And now we've kind of gone down this road where like every year there's some new, euphemism acronym law that's like the SAFE Act or the Patriot Act or the Liberty Act, or it's all nonsense. It's all like clearly like limiting. So we have the current system is sliding in this direction, right? And it's having an impact on society and our culture in terms of making privacy feel like a bad thing, right? It's like it's designed to make you feel like privacy is not okay, or that what do you have to hide? That's sort of the cultural impact of this slow and steady grinding of policy that's aimed at building a tighter surveillance and control system. And this is in one of the freest countries in the world. I mean, you can imagine what it's like in a dictatorship like China, right? So I guess, can you give us some insight into why you wanted to deliver that talk, which was right after policymakers had just spoken, so you knew you were going to get them to listen. What was the significance of delivering that? And what is your, what kind of hope do you have that maybe Bitcoin can maybe divert this slide that we're on, I would say, not just in America, but in Britain as well?
Yeah, so one of the characteristics of the era that we're living through right now is a collapse of trust in institutions. And these include institutions of governance. They also include private sector institutions, corporations, churches, voluntary associations. I mean, if you look at the data, participation in civil society organizations has dropped off precipitously over the last few years. More and more people say basically that they don't trust anyone, any institutions. And I would suggest that is a direct result of the institutions of governance no longer trusting the people. So in the United States, we have a framework of ostensibly government by the people for the people. That doesn't work if you don't trust the people. And what we've seen particularly since the 1970s, is the slow erosion of trust in the American people by the government to, in effect, be able to responsibly direct their lives. And so we are now kind of trapped in what some psychologists call complementarity, which is the logic of doer and done to, tit for tat, eye for an eye. Some person, some individual commits a crime somewhere, the entire edifice of the American federal state gets re-architected around the possibility of precluding such a crime in the future. And this creates a reciprocal erosion of trust that destroys institutions over time.
Yeah, I mean, any of you who've come to the United States and any of you who've left your own country and come back here know that one of the strange things about democracy is, as Natalie's pointing out, is we've become a lot less trusting of our population, and we search you super thoroughly when you go to the airport. I mean, this didn't used to happen, right? It's like you didn't used to get essentially like strip searched when you go through the airport. Or, sir, can you take out your bags? Ma'am, can you take this out? Taking out all your cords and all the crap. And, it's kind of a nightmare to travel through Britain now. It's crazy. I mean, it really feels, but it's meant it does. It's not just procedure. It does something, right? It makes you feel like you're being watched. It makes you feel like you're in a police state. It's pretty wild, right? And I do think that is part of the intent of such programs, is to make you, obviously is to make you feel like you're being watched, and it's done by an institution that, as you say, is not trusting you as much, and is taking some of that liberty away, actually, and replacing it with control. So your remarks were kind of pointed at the financial system, and you talked about the Bank Secrecy Act, which, at the time when it was created in the 70s in the United States, there was dissent among judges. I mean, it ended up getting passed, but if you read the dissent, it's really interesting, because the judges that at the Supreme Court level that didn't want the Bank Secrecy Act, they were pretty eloquent about the risks that it would entail. That was a time sort of almost before digital money. Like, credit cards had just become a thing, but the whole era of today was just a dream, right? We didn't know where it was going to go. And they were basically just thinking about paper checks and things like that. And they were spooked. They were like, even, this idea that, private companies have to report about their customer behavior to the government, it really was spooky to some of these judges. Unfortunately, they weren't in the majority. We lost. We ended up going into this direction that you spoke about. And, it's exacerbated by the fact that it's never adjusted for inflation. So these thresholds that were adopted in the 70s were never adjusted for inflation. So, what may have been reasonable then, maybe, right, which is like, okay, what would be today, like anything over $75,000 has to be maybe, revealed to the government. And maybe reasonable people agree that that's maybe reasonable. But they never adjusted for inflation, so now it's like, it's going all the way down to today, where it's $10,000, right? But $10,000 back then is $75,000 today, right? So, if you think about the types of transactions that were in the dragnet, it has increased by orders of magnitude. They didn't have to change anything, they just didn't adjust for inflation. Which is, of course, ironic, because they adjust all kinds of other policies for inflation, like taxes and things like that, right? And now they're trying to make it even more of a dragnet with the travel rule and all these other things. So again, to your point there, in the financial sector, you have a banking system which is increasingly politicized, right? There's now, like, the government is making it very clear that they'll only bail out certain kinds of banks, or et cetera, that only certain kinds of people will get banked. And they're exerting more and more control over basically the flow of funds. And then we have this other ecosystem emerging, where it's peer-to-peer, which is what you spoke about. Can you unpack that for us in terms of what kind of cultural impact do you think that could actually make if peer-to-peer usage of money becomes more widespread?
Yeah, so peer-to-peer is just an exercise of my inherent capabilities as a human being. It's not even a question of rights, it's a question of capability. Can you transact peer-to-peer? Well, of course. And simply by doing things that we can do over time, that sediments into a habit that then forms our character, which then informs how we live life as a society. And so any human society is founded in individuals, meaning it is individuals who are acting, who are believing, who are forming relationships, and out of that constellation of actions and relationships, society is constituted. Often what authoritarians will try to do is they'll try to convince you that society happens at their pleasure, that they're in fact giving you a society to live in. Well, that's fundamentally backwards. And so all peer-to-peer is just materially reminding people of the order of operations.
And, let's say we move forward. Let's say we have a society where Bitcoin plays a larger and larger role. I mean, how do you see that impacting the policies and laws and norms that, we currently find ourselves in the middle of? Like, we're in this sort of descending trajectory, unfortunately, into a society that's more and more surveilled, and where people have less and less sort of freedom and control, even in what we would call liberal democracies, right? Do you think that Bitcoin can change things, or do you think this is sort of inexorable.
Yeah, so institutions tend to not reform themselves. And this is the sad truth. I had the opportunity in DC to speak with many of the folks you work with at the Human Rights Foundation, who also talked about their work in Ukraine, in Russia, in Nicaragua, in Afghanistan, in countries with very repressive governments. The primary audience for these human rights activists is actually not the dictators in their country. Like they know those people don't care. Their primary audience is the political elite in the West. They're in Brussels. They're in DC. They're telling their stories over and over again. Please don't weaponize AML KYC because it's people like me who suffer. It's people like me who get debanked. And these policymakers, they listen, they nod gravely, they congratulate them, and then they just continue on building the very same surveillance regime that these people are escaping from. And so what are they doing? I mean, they're just using Bitcoin. Like, they're not asking for permission. Alexei Navalny's funeral expenses were paid in Bitcoin. Bitcoin was the only cash that the Anti-Corruption Foundation had that wasn't seized by the Russian state. That's just one example. And so, it's fine to engage with policymakers. It's important. It's good to tell your story. But at the end of the day, building orthogonal institutions that cannot be captured is the only way to reclaim your liberty.
Yeah, and it was very clear that your talk was trying to remind people that they have the power and that it's not up to the, representatives to decide. It's up to the people. And, I think that's very central to the ethos of the activists and developers that created Bitcoin and a lot of the associated privacy technology that we now use. I mean, their whole mantra was cypherpunks write code, and, the idea was basically, we don't ask for permission. Maybe you ask for forgiveness later, but you go ahead and you do it. And it was born out of this, I think, frustration in the 1980s, actually, where they just sort of figured out that lobbying wasn't going to help. And I think there's certainly cases where protest and lobbying does obviously help over time. I mean, look at the civil rights movement or any, there's many, many examples. But in this particular case, lobbying wasn't going to help. What people needed to do was build technology that allowed people to interact peer-to-peer and then let the law and sort of let the social legal structure settle on top of that, which is what happened. I mean, basically, at the time, President Clinton in the United States in the early 90s and Senator Biden and a lot of the same people who are in power now wanted to ban privacy on the internet. They wanted to make privacy technology illegal. They wanted to make it impossible to export. They wanted to jail Phil Zimmerman, who created PGP. They wanted to put a clipper chip inside everybody's phone. They didn't want any sort of end-to-end encryption. They wanted, as the UK government recently, wanted, they wanted to be a man in the middle, basically, for every sort of secret communication. And their argument was that, hey, if we don't do this, drug dealers and terrorists and, pedophiles and criminals are going to run amok. And thankfully, a group of civil liberties activists, developers, and entrepreneurs pushed back, and we basically won the right to privacy. And then there was this big culture war, right, where it was like, it finally became cool in a way to have privacy recently, but for 20, 30 years it was difficult. It became normal and cool, right? Like rappers sing about privacy, and Elon sing to use Signal, and people sort of like understand that Signal's cool or that privacy is cool. Like, it was not cool for a long time, and even the head chief spook, who was head of the basically head of one of America's largest intelligence services during 9/11, he later came out, Michael Hayden, and said that Americans have the right to encrypt, which is pretty amazing, actually. So you had a guy who was in charge of surveillance over the course of his career come out and say, okay, we need to have the right to encrypt. So we saw like the cultural impact of privacy technology work. Like, the battle's not over. You still have people like Bill Barr who want to go in and try to like force privacy providers to comply. And often what's nice about being open source software builders is you can say there's nothing we can do about it. I mean, what is Signal really going to do? I mean, they don't know. They don't know what, they know we've said something, but they don't know what, right? And now they're making that even harder because they've added, messaging, basically usernames instead of phone numbers. So I think this is amazing. So the idea is, okay, we've seen this in the realm of communications. We've seen open source software change society, where the establishment went from being afraid of privacy to now being generally supportive of it. I mean, they use it themselves. Like the political campaigns, as you see the race heat up in America for the election this year, both campaigns will use Signal. They're not going to use plain text. They're not dumb. And they've learned that this is fine. So that took decades. I mean, do you see something similar happening with peer-to-peer open source financial software and with Bitcoin? I mean, do you think this is going to take decades? I mean, how do you kind of see this playing out in terms of going from, again, kind of like a niche thing, which is sort of where we were in the early 90s, right? Where the government is a little antagonistic. I mean, do you see us getting to a place where it becomes cool and normal?
I mean, it may enjoy wider cultural currency, which, I think your observation is astute. That said, the state is never going to back down. There's a great book called The Crypto Wars that traces the history of attempts by the U.S. intelligence state to break encryption, going all the way back to the Second World War. And these attempts continue. If one bill is defeated in Congress, it's reintroduced, within the next few years under a different name. If the government loses a court case here, they'll just bring another one elsewhere. They'll continue to push because their fundamental point of view is that no one should have encryption. That there always needs to be a backdoor. There always needs to be.
Is that a partisan view in your mind, or is that
No.
just a power and control structural
it is
thing?
A structural characteristic of the state, and so the only opportunity for a narrow corridor, and it's a narrow corridor of liberty to occur, is for there to be a balance of power between the state and society. Society meaning, anyone. It could be an individual, it could be civil society organizations, but the state has to be aware that if they push, society will push back. And it's that creates the opportunity, the opening for freedom. If one side gets too powerful, if the state gets too powerful, you see tyranny. If the state is too weak, quote unquote, the way that manifests is collapse of the rule of law, generally. And so it becomes more of a free-for-all. And so the rule of law, it doesn't have to be a legalistic state. It's just a basic set of norms and agreements around how we do business, how we cooperate within certain parameters that generally keeps the playing field fair. And so you need both of these elements together.
So basically, you would say that, reflecting on the crypto wars and what we see today, where even though there may be some victories, we constantly get these new, again, euphemistic acronym bills coming in, the SAFE Act, the Patriot Act, whatever. There's just this ongoing attack against privacy that we have to fight back against. Essentially the cost of freedom is eternal vigilance, essentially, is what we see. But when it comes to, again, Bitcoin, financial freedom, what you're basically saying is it's not going to be easy and people are going to have to fight for it. So what does that look like to you? I mean, is there, can you give us some detail into how do you think this is going to go? And when it comes to a country like the United Kingdom or the United States that has individual liberties kind of in its history and culture, or at least the struggle to get more liberties is part of the story in these countries, as opposed to a communist government or a fascist government, Could you see Bitcoin maybe improving these democratic countries and maybe steering them away from some of these basically corrupt trajectories that they're on?
So certainly the adoption of Bitcoin has the potential to enable people to do things they otherwise would not be able to do, both from just a personal wealth building standpoint, but also from a capital deployment standpoint. I mean, what we're seeing today in Bedford is the result of that. So there's an extraordinary opportunity there. But in terms of, the old 19th, 20th century political categories of like communist, socialist regimes, capitalist regimes, I would suggest that those designations don't really apply anymore. I think more and more there's a kind of consolidated world model of government that some French economists have referred to as dirigiste, which is basically a form of command economy, where the state directs market activity, the state directs capital allocation. But it's not socialist in its, let's say, general welfare commitments for the people in the same way that some of these earlier forms of government were. And that's kind of the consensus mode of governing today. And so there's a broader question of political economy. How can we actually peel back some of this command and control logic and perhaps let markets flourish? And I think that Bitcoin is a part of that solution, but not the entirety of it.
Do you think when it comes to the different ways people adopt Bitcoin, what is your take on how you adopt Bitcoin and what kind of impact it can have? Obviously, using your dollars or pounds to buy a derivative like an ETF, where you don't actually end up controlling it yourself and you treat it essentially like any other security, might be very different from you taking the time and effort to self-custody Bitcoin and to maybe spend it and to think about saving it yourself and backing it up. And how do these two ways of using Bitcoin maybe have impact on culture or not?
Yeah, I think people will, if they haven't already, will soon, and I mean within the next few years, figure out that if they are storing their wealth in a custodial solution, that solution is already captured by the state. So, eventually they're going to encounter limits on what they can do with their own capital. And so they may begin asking questions at that point: how do I self-custody? But that is still a learning curve.
And do you think that, do you have any thoughts on Bitcoin's sort of limits in terms of maybe being able to be self-custodial for an entire population? Obviously right now, today, it probably can't do that, if we're just being honest. Do you think that it's important that we get to a world where everybody could self-custody to have the cultural impact that we may hope it has? Or do you think that a small group of people self-custodying is enough to sort of change state behavior?
Yeah, I would suggest that lowering the costs of self-custody is perhaps the most important macro objective right now in the Bitcoin universe. There are a lot of companies and individuals working on this problem. And I think, getting those costs down, both in terms of material costs and complexity, technical complexity, are critical evolution of the project of human liberty.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to follow these efforts. On the one hand, there's no free lunch, and there's only 21 million Bitcoin, and there's a particular way in which UTXOs move and operate, and that's just a reality, a hard reality. But on the other hand, there's a lot of incredible creative ways people are thinking about this obstacle, which again is going to have a huge impact. Like if you can't afford to self-custody in 10 years, again, I kind of think that has a huge, that really steers the way Bitcoin may impact culture. Are you like a second-class citizen, essentially? Like, are we back to where we started? So, a couple ideas that I've heard that I think are interesting are, well, first of all, Bitcoin is always free to receive, right? You can always spin up a wallet, and it doesn't matter how expensive the fees are, it's free to receive. So that's interesting. So anyone could earn Bitcoin on chain without having to pay a fee to receive, but they obviously would have to pay a network fee to move it, right? If you want to be self-custodial. Well, there's interesting concepts around that. Instead of sending you my Bitcoin in a transaction, I can give you my private key. There's things like that. So I wouldn't say all hope is lost on this, and actually, I think the number of talented designers and developers that are going to come into the space over the next decade is impossible for us to predict. Basically, in 2050, if Time Magazine, if it's still around then, does a top 10 people in Bitcoin history, I think that the top, 7 of them aren't in Bitcoin yet. And, we don't know what kind of incredible innovations they're going to bring to bear. I mean, just think about what's been happening in the last few years alone. So I would say, let's look at this carefully, because I agree with Natalie that making sure that as many people as possible can self-custody is the best way to stop this descent into basically a police state that we've seen, unfortunately, happen, both at the, as you were saying, command economy level and at the micro level. We need to make sure we don't make the wrong trade-offs when we do that. Self-custody should be the goal. It shouldn't be acceptable that people without money, use some credit mechanism. But I do feel strongly that, we shouldn't sacrifice the basic ideals in order to get there. So we'll have to see. And anything else you wanted to touch on? Sure.
So we're in an era of refounding of institutions. This happens periodically throughout human history, so it's not an anomaly. But I think one of the things that is being renegotiated is the relationship between the individual and society, and the societies we're a part of. And so I would just invite you all to be a part of that conversation. You're already readers and thinkers, but it's from you that our forms of government and our imaginative possibilities materialize. So let's keep building it together.
And what kind of how do you connect the culture in America with culture in Britain, politically speaking? How do you feel like, might Bitcoin take us in different directions, or do you feel like it kind of is steering us the same way? I mean, Britain doesn't have the same constitutional protections. Obviously, there's some worrying stuff in both countries happening, but in Britain especially around surveillance. What do you have to say about the transatlantic divide?
Well, I think what the UK has that's extraordinary is the legacy of particularly early modern and Enlightenment era political thought that first began articulating bottom up the case for a small state and a laissez-faire approach to economic transacting. I mean, Adam Smith, in many ways, was the founder not just of the discipline of economics, but of social sciences writ large. And there is an extraordinary legacy in this country of grounding natural rights in a priori arguments, philosophical arguments and political arguments. So that tradition is available. And then there are ways of building upon that in the present day that any member of these traditions, whether in the US or UK, can choose to build on.
Well, here. So build on that. Let's build on the classic liberal traditions that this island, basically gave to the world. Let's build on some of the best parts of American traditions, like the Bill of Rights. And, at least in my view, these things are very compatible with Bitcoin. And I think Bitcoin might even bring us a little bit closer to being able to realize those values. Thank you, Natalie, for your inspiration and for standing up for our rights and for freedom, even against maybe the biggest challengers and foes. And we'll see you guys later. Thank you so much.
Please welcome to the stage Alex Gladstein of the Human Rights Foundation. Take it away.
Hey, everybody. Good morning. Amazing to be here. So impressed with what Peter and his team have done. There's more people here in Bedford than in events that I've been at in London and New York City and San Francisco. So really hats off to him and his team. So going to talk about Bitcoin as a cheat code for human rights today. And it's a cheat code that we really need because the odds are stacked against us. The odds are stacked against dissidents and activists everywhere. There's increasing control over the system, as you've heard from other speakers today. And I wanted to start with just a visual of like the transformation of money. And I think that Lynn Alden's book does a really good job of laying this out in detail. But basically, money used to be mostly a bare instrument, right? Like when you would transact and buy something, you didn't give up much information about yourself. The person on the other side, if you were buying a newspaper or a medical procedure or whatever you were doing, they don't know your address or your email or your birth date or what you bought last or what you're most likely to buy next. There's really no way to like socially engineer you or try to steer society in a particular way when you're using paper or metal money. And that was totally fine, legally, morally, ethically. We lived like that. That's the way the society worked for a very long time. Now money's different, right? So when you use your phone or a card or a chip, you reveal like such an enormous amount of information about yourself. And this is a pretty profound shift in that we reveal all these little micro details to all these third parties. And I remember one time I actually walked into a pet store to buy some food for my dog, and I used a card in a terminal in the store, in a brick and mortar shop, to buy some toothbrush-shaped dog treats, okay? And I walked out of the store, and I happened to check Instagram a couple minutes later, and I was hit with an advertisement for toothbrush-shaped dog treats. And I started to think about, wait, how did that happen? It's not geolocation, because how did they know that I didn't buy like parakeet food or cat food or something like that? So, what I realized is that my card issuer, and I researched this and figured this out, but basically the card issuer that I was using basically sells the transaction data immediately to like a whole bunch of different markets. And then those markets sell that information to advertisers who try to get you to buy their stuff. So it's kind of amazing that like anytime you're doing a digital transaction today with the legacy system, you're participating in this massive surveillance machine, basically. And that can be, you could argue that can optimize certain things about society, but it can obviously be used for great control. This sort of piece you see on the right is the game that we're playing. I mean, it is the battleground. And we need a different kind of mechanism. I think we need a cheat code, because I think that in terms of digital payments, if we stick with the financial system as it is, it leads inexorably towards total control over your life. I mean, that's where it goes. That's what central bank digital currencies are, is the stripping out of all paper and metal money from the economy, and the state having total control over what people spend, how they can spend it, how much they can spend, and what you can buy. So we desperately needed a cheat code, and Satoshi gave that to us in 2009, and many, many others have been building thanklessly to get it to the point where it is today, where it can actually be a potential pathway to a different future. And we need it quite badly, because there are so many instances of governments abusing the financial system to go after their critics. And what I wanted to do here was give you a sense of how dictators and governments around the world are going after people's money in a political sense, and then show you how people are reacting by using Bitcoin. So when we talk about human rights activism, money and currency are often not the topic of conversation. They're often not included. For 15 years, I helped run a human rights event where we'd have speakers from all over the world, and they would almost never mention money or currency or transactions. And, later on, I realized that all of them had problems with this, but they didn't associate it with human rights in their mind. They associated it with logistics or administrative something or accounting or whatever. So the challenge is for us to bring that back together and to make sure that money and finance is part of the human rights conversation, because it's how governments try to stop activism. So obviously, one of the first prominent ways that governments went after critics was obviously, WikiLeaks and Julian Assange, and they made a banking blockade against him. Using the financial system to go after adversaries is something that really started to ramp up after 9/11. There's a new book called Paper Soldiers about the weaponization of the dollar system that I'd recommend. It's pretty interesting. It just came out. And, it details how all of these, things like OFAC and all of these acronyms, FATF, these were all sort of launched and perfected in the late 90s and early 2000s as money started to digitize, right? And what you start to realize is that like the Treasury Department of a country is basically an intelligence service. Like they have their own intelligence services. And this is really a way that governments fight their wars today is through the financial system. So that book does a good job of detailing this. And of course, you've seen that, entire sanctions be laid at countries. But what I'm more concerned about is individual attacks on activists, right? I mean, so we of course have seen that. And then post WikiLeaks, we've seen all kinds of governments freeze accounts in Hong Kong, in India, in Russia, and in Canada. Governments understand that if they want to neutralize a protest or someone opposing them, one of the best things they can do is go after their bank accounts, and it's increasingly their first option. In fact, a few weeks ago, the Indian government froze the bank accounts of the largest opposition party, which is insane, in the world's largest democracy with the world's biggest elections. There was also a case a few weeks ago in Hungary, Orban has created a task force to basically identify critics and then freeze their bank accounts. So this is something that all autocrats and governments, regardless of color or stripe, are starting to do around the world. I thought this was pretty shocking. In Nicaragua, the Ortega regime, so it could be on the right, it could be on the left, it could be capitalist governments, communist governments, doesn't matter. They're all following the same playbook. In Nicaragua, the socialist Ortega regime is basically, they freeze the bank accounts of every Catholic church, Jesuit university. They're really going after the religious establishment in the country, which is really insane because the Catholic Church is actually quite popular in Central America. So it just shows you how far governments are going. I thought this was also pretty staggering. Recently, a few weeks ago, it came out that there's a new law that the dictatorship of Iran is trying to pass where they're basically going to use AI and surveillance cameras to auto-fine women who do not comply with the hijab laws. So basically, if you're not wearing your hair the right way, that these mullahs want you to wear it, you're going to get an automatic fine deducted from your bank account. That's insane, and that's also something that is made even easier with something like a CBDC, right? Because not everybody in a society uses banking. A lot of people use the informal economy. A lot of people use cash. So if we can, if you're a government official and you think you can strip that out of society and get rid of paper and metal money and replace it with a CBDC, then this kind of activity is total. I mean, you'll have total control, and you can absolutely do this where we know that surveillance cameras are increasing in size and number, and we know that AI is increasing in what it can do. I mean, Britain is a great example of what most people would consider democracy. That's also probably one of the most frontier places for surveillance in the world. I mean, London is one of the most surveilled cities on the planet, right? So you can imagine all the kinds of things that are going to happen even in London. I mean, it might start at first in a way that might appear harmless. Oh, it's gonna find people who jump the till in the underground or whatever. But then eventually it'll become like this. It'll become fines for behavior that's not acceptable, right? In the eyes of the authorities. So we desperately need a different kind of system. Now, what's interesting is that activists for a long time have been using Bitcoin as an escape, right? So this was an article from about 2017, and Assange was forced to use Bitcoin. I don't think that he wanted to use it. I think he would have preferred to just use the dollars, but the powers that be cut him off, right? So he ended up using Bitcoin. I still remember the day when the WikiLeaks account pasted the address. And, we talk about use cases of Bitcoin. I mean, that was one of the biggest first use cases of Bitcoin that was so obvious. I mean, WikiLeaks could not fundraise with dollars or euros, but they could fundraise with Bitcoin. So that's like a really, really clear way that he used Bitcoin as a cheat code of sorts, right? And it ended up being, pretty beneficial to him and his colleagues because some of the Bitcoin they held on to, and it delivered pretty staggering returns and allowed them to continue their activism. So that was quite interesting. This was our first Bitcoin activism encounter. This was in 2013, and in that summer, people were gathering in Ukraine and getting together in what would later become the Maidan Square protests. And in September of that year, we got a call from a friend of mine, and he said, listen, would you guys be willing to participate in a fundraiser? And we got our chairman, Gary Kasparov, involved, and you can see that down there. And we participated in this. And it was interesting to us because, again, we had seen the WikiLeaks thing, but remember, Bitcoin was pretty sketchy back then. I mean, it wasn't worth very much. Not many people used it. It's nothing like today, right? So, but we were like, listen, we're taking an open mind here. And it worked. I mean, look, only Bitcoin can reach them. I think that's such a powerful statement. It's so true. At the time, even though Bitcoin wasn't very trusted or known, and it didn't work it was hard to use, like wallets totally sucked, like all the usability was bad. It still was the only thing that could reach these people because the government had frozen their bank accounts. And this is the case in so many places today. Only Bitcoin can reach them. I think that's a really interesting mantra. So there are lots of examples of NGOs that have used Bitcoin. They've not necessarily gone out and said, "Oh, we love Bitcoin. We want to use Bitcoin. We love 21 million. We love all these things. We, hate, Keynesian economics." No. This is not how people think. They use Bitcoin because it works, because it's the only thing. I mean, I was talking to a Belarusian guy who was part of a big movement that used Bitcoin, and he's like, "I don't like Bitcoin. I don't particularly think it's the best form of money, and I'm not that interested in any of the culture around it, but we use it because it works." And I think that that's something that is going to spark another wave of adoption here. Is increasingly governments are censoring and limiting and controlling, and people are going to have to use this thing, even if they don't align with what is perceived to be its culture or the people who use it. They're going to use it because they have to. And I think this is kind of a very interesting thing. I mean, here you can see that the Anti-Corruption Foundation, founded by Alexei Navalny, had started to raise money in Bitcoin in 2016. And they actually received hundreds of Bitcoin over that time period. And it constituted, a meaningful source of income, and in a way that donors could donate without doxing themselves to the Russian government. Because obviously, before ACF was kicked out of Russia, if you made a donation through the banking system to ACF, the government would know that you did that, and then you would have a red flag next to your little file at the Kremlin, right? So it was a vital lifeline, and now it's very important for them because they've been kicked out of Russia, and they have to pay people in different countries, and the fiat system just doesn't really work for them. But Bitcoin works. A few years ago in Nigeria, Bitcoin helped power a very large protest against police brutality. Again, fiat systems started to fail in different ways for different reasons. Some of them were intentional. There was some literally, government officials trying to freeze stuff. Elsewise, systems just failed. They don't work very well. They're pretty fragile. And so one of the big organizations coordinating the protests is called the Feminist Coalition. They decided to use Bitcoin, and later they ended up using BTC Pay Server, and they raised a good amount of Bitcoin, hundreds of thousands of dollars, to keep these protests going. At a lot of these protests, people live day to day, and they can't really afford to go to a protest for 3 days in a row because they'll run out of money. So it's actually important for protest organizers in a lot of places to provide water, food, services. Protesting costs money, so it's really important to keep that going. And you can see something similar here in Belarus. Throughout the Belarusian revolution, basically, over the last 4 years, Bitcoin's been pretty vital because Lukashenko, the dictator there, has basically, taken total control of the banking system. So here's just yet another example of how Bitcoin's been powering democratic protests around the world. One very important way that Bitcoin's kind of a cheat code is that it allows people to escape a dictatorship. Obviously, I've shown you examples of how people are trying to countries from the inside with Bitcoin. But there's also people who just have to leave, whether it be Afghanistan, Syria, Lebanon, Venezuela. Some people just decide to leave. And the crazy part is that you can bring your wealth with you in a way that was never possible before. You can't do that with dollars or euros, right? You can't memorize sovereignly a lot of money or even a decent amount of money and then flee with the clothes on your back to a new place with fiat currency. It doesn't work. I've had friends try this. Before Bitcoin, a lot of activists would have to sew money into their clothing and get on an airplane and go somewhere to try to fund something. It's very dangerous. And there's obviously limits to how much money you can bring with you. Like if you just have the clothes on your back and you're hiking out of a Venezuelan jungle into Colombia, right? Well, this person wrote this piece in the New York Times. I mean, they basically brought their seed phrase with them and started a new life elsewhere. I know a similar story. A friend of mine, Mauricio, he escaped from Venezuela with his two brothers, and they did the same thing. They basically brought their wealth with them and started a new life, and now he runs a company in Canada. So this is an incredible use case and an amazing cheat code that Bitcoin provides people that we didn't have 75, 80 years ago. You know, I had ancestors who fled from the Holocaust, and they weren't able to bring anything with them. They couldn't bring their wealth with them. Well, now you can. I mean, I've met people in Iran who've sold their home in Iran for Bitcoin and then left and got on a plane to the United States, and they were able to bring their family wealth with them. That's an incredible revolution in monetary technology. Yet another reason why Bitcoin matters for human rights is that it can fund education in underground, basically. So girls in Afghanistan haven't had school for more than 800 days since the Taliban took over, and you can't use the US dollar to fund women's education in Afghanistan. It is not possible to use the US dollar to do that, but you can use Bitcoin to do it, and people do that. Now, this started a long time ago. If you look at the date on this article, it's 2014. So people have been using Bitcoin to educate women in Afghanistan for a decade. But now it's really like, again, only Bitcoin can reach them. This is like the theme. Like, this continues to be true today. What happens today is people use Bitcoin and stable coins to send value into Afghanistan. The teachers receive it minutes later on their phone, and then they go and cash it out into local currency. You can't do this with the US dollar. It doesn't work like that. There's the details of Canada, I think, are quite interesting when you had the trucker protest. When the Canadian government decided to freeze the protesters who didn't agree with the biomedical policy of the Canadian government, the fiat system was able to be frozen immediately. The Trudeau administration was able to just press like a red button and freeze everybody's GoFundMes and PayPals and whatever. And then they had all this information about all those people that they could use against them. You know, Bitcoin's different. There is no big red button. So they did try to go after the people involved. It's true. And they did try to go through the court system and do all these things. But because there was no big red button, it took them a lot of time to actually go to the court, try to get a search warrant, all this stuff. And in the meantime, 70% of what was raised was able to be given to the truckers. So regardless of how you feel politically about that protest, this shows you, something about the technical capacity of Bitcoin and how it's superior for this sort of work in the human rights space as compared to fiat. There's even stuff in what we would call advanced economies, right, and beyond Canada. Sex workers in Europe and the United States use Bitcoin all the time because, again, they get their accounts frozen by fiat companies who don't like what they're doing. You could say the same thing about marijuana companies, gun companies, people trying to give abortions in states where now it's illegal, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there's so many use cases for this thing, and it matters, so immensely as a progressive technology. This is a little post, let's see if we can get it to go, of a guy who's using Bitcoin to support people in Palestine.
Hey guys, assalamu alaikum, Hani
We got it.
here. Just a quick thing, cryptocurrency is different things to different people, right? Some people take it seriously, some people don't. And I've worked with it a little bit in the sense of charitable giving and all that. It didn't really translate to be a very strong option at the time. But what is happening right now is a lot of people in Gaza are getting help and getting relief through cryptocurrency. A lot of these exchange shops, foreign exchange and currency exchange shops, have crypto or digital wallets that they receive money. So I am able to send money to my sister in Rafah through digital wallets and cryptocurrency. The popular ones right now is USDT. That's one that pretty much the shops deal with it. They feel safe and secure. In fact, it's so good that they require a small fee. So if I send PayPal, they ask for 15%. With crypto, they ask for 5% or less.
Sorry for that. Anyway, that puts an exclamation point on it. I mean, what he was basically saying is that Bitcoin and Tether are being used extensively to send money to families from Americans and Europeans who have family in Palestine. They're using these rails. They can't use the fiat rail. You can't just go to your bank and send money to your sister in Gaza. It doesn't work. But you can use something like Bitcoin, and in the meantime, Tether, which is sort of like a proxy for what Bitcoin does, it has its own downsides, but it does a similar use case. The point being, another very important use case. And then we had look at Ukraine, and I'm trying to give you examples of like different kinds of political conflicts in different contexts in different countries, because it shouldn't matter what your politics are. You might be right-wing, left-wing, libertarian, progressive, it doesn't matter. There are people out there that share your beliefs that need this thing, whether they be environmentalists or gun lovers or whatever. Like, people will need this thing regardless of who they are, right? In this case, we just looked at Palestine, which is a cause that's usually associated with people on the left. And here we have Ukraine, which is usually associated maybe more in the other direction. But either way, the point is that Ukrainians, were expelled. They fled. Tons of them went to Europe, and they didn't have bank accounts. And they were able to use Bitcoin and flee with their wealth with them. Even in North Korea, even in the darkest place in the world, Bitcoin is being used. I think this is remarkable. So North Koreans flee from North Korea, and then they get stuck in China. And 70% of people who flee from North Korea are women, and most of them get sex trafficked. And there are organizations that save these people. They go in and they basically pay a broker, and they rescue them, right? So this is being done with Bitcoin, which is pretty amazing, because it's really hard to do this with traditional fiat currency. So, even in the darkest, most difficult parts of the world, this thing's really shining, and it's again, really providing a cheat code. To kind of summarize why this thing has this global appeal, it doesn't matter where you are. With Bitcoin, Xi can't micro-track you, Putin can't freeze you, the Burmese can't delete your records, which they like to do for ethnic minorities, and if you're in Venezuela, Chavismo can't hyperinflate you. This is actually an image of a highway in Venezuela a few years ago, and the Venezuelan government tried to block all the aid coming in. What you don't see in the picture are the millions of dollars of Bitcoin coming in and out that they can't stop anymore. So this idea of governments having like total control over the people is something that we can, really leave in the dustbin of history thanks to Bitcoin, which is pretty amazing. This is go Satoshi. This. Just to sort of wrap up and conclude here, this is an image I took. I was with Peter in several of the folks that were here at the conference speaking. We took a trip to East Africa, and we visited a place called Malawi. This is a country in Southeast Africa. And this is just a picture I took on my phone of a street market. And what's amazing is these people have just gone through a 44% currency devaluation that they didn't vote for or have any knowledge of. It was just imposed on them. So all of a sudden, and this is already the poorest country in the world pretty much. I mean, people in rural Malawi make about $100 a year, okay? So they don't need a 44% currency devaluation. But it was imposed upon them. And you can just think about all these people, they have 56% of the value that they had 3 weeks earlier. Totally unfair. I think it's a crime against humanity. And again, Bitcoin gives people a way out. It gives them access to a currency that can't just be sort of, looted in the same way. And this is more detail about that. These people didn't deserve this. They didn't vote for this. They didn't get asked about it. No one asked them, do you want to lose 44% of your purchasing power so that exporters can sell more goods? No, that never happened. It just was sort of imposed on them. The crazy part is everybody in Malawi has a phone, at least a feature phone, but often smartphone. And using Machinkura and other kinds of technology, they can onboard into Bitcoin. So this is pretty cool. This is going to happen. And we so desperately need this cheat code. And it could happen to anyone. I mean, essentially what happened to Malawi happened in America in 1933. If you think about what a currency devaluation is, when FDR seized gold of Americans to fund the New Deal, essentially it was a massive devaluation of the dollar against gold, right? So these things could happen anywhere. I mean, I know we're very cozy in our own societies, but don't ever think that this couldn't happen to you, I guess is the point. Just a few final notes here. The grant making that we do around the world is increasingly in Bitcoin. I mean, when we talk to activists and we say, do you want the wire in US dollars or do you want a Bitcoin payment? A lot of them want the Bitcoin, okay? The CBDCs, as we discussed, it's kind of the end game of fiat. That's where we would be going, and this gives us another way out. And at the end of the day, you have to think about how the dictators feel about Bitcoin. How do Putin and Xi feel about it? What do they need, right? So dictators need censorship, confiscation, and closed capital markets. That's what they need. Their societies would collapse without this. The CCP cannot exist without these things. And guess what? What is Bitcoin? And to what extent is actually, the values behind, let's say, the United Kingdom or America on a good day? What are the good things that we stand for? Well, they're things like this: free speech, property rights, and open capital markets, right? So my kind of bullish case for, let's say, the US or the UK would be that I think in our DNA, in our social DNA, we actually can thrive with Bitcoin, because a democratic government that's accountable to the people should have no issue with free speech, property rights, and open capital markets. But a dictatorship should have a lot of issues. It's going to be a big, big problem for dictators. And that's something that gets me very excited as a human rights activist, right? One thing I will say is that a lot of activism is virtue signaling. Like, okay, so you go onto Twitter or whatever and you post, free this country. What does that actually do? Nothing. I mean, it doesn't really do anything. But if you can basically teach someone how to use Bitcoin, I mean, they can meaningfully improve their personal financial freedom, right? That's a cheat code. That's pretty amazing. I think this is a new higher form of human rights activism. And I think that pound for pound, helping people learn about Bitcoin, it might be the single most effective form of human rights activism, like pound for pound, if you actually think about what it does for people and how it can educate them, how it can lift them up. I'm a traditional human rights activist, and you know what? I'm very proud of what we've done, but oftentimes you get very jaded because a lot of it doesn't work, and we do all this work and there's still so much death and suffering, right? So I think the fact that we now have a different way to approach this that can be done quietly, that can be done peacefully, that can be done individually, person by person, is very deeply inspiring. And in the same way that a currency devaluation can be devastating for 20 million people overnight, I think Bitcoin education can be equally liberating the other way if we can do it the right way. And I was going to say, just personally, how Bitcoin's been like a cheat code for me. I was thinking about this, and there's this Japanese concept of ikigai, where if you can do something and get paid for it, and do what you're good at, and do what you love, and do what the world needs, you get this ikigai thing where you're in like this flow state where just things start to happen to you that are really positive. So this happened to me with Bitcoin. Like I had a 10-year career of being a human rights activist. I liked it. It was great, but it was hard, and it was a struggle. And then I started to learn about how Bitcoin mattered for human rights, and I started to apply these things. And I've now entered into this like crazy flow state where wild things happen to me, like being in a room in front of all of you people in Bedford. This would have never happened before. So I want to thank Bitcoin for being my personal cheat code as well. And finally, I just wanted to shill what we're doing. We're doing a financial freedom track at the Oslo Freedom Forum in June. We're going to have some awesome speakers. All these people will be with us in person. We'll have more. And we'll have like 3 full days of like basically getting to hang out with really brave human rights activists, listening to them, figuring out how we can help them, and then also listening to these folks and get their opinions on what's most important for this work. So this is applied. This is not just theory. We're going to be applying theory into practice, which gets me really excited. So anyway, thank you guys so much. Hopefully I've given you some strong examples of why we need Bitcoin and why it is a cheat code. So thanks, and we'll see you around. Take care.